You're watching your city burn on the news. Riots in the streets. Police overwhelmed. And then you hear the president might deploy the military, not overseas, but right here in American cities to restore order. Your neighbor says that's martial law. Your uncle says it's constitutional. Your friend says it's fascism. But here's what almost nobody knows. There's an actual law for this. It's over 200 years old, and it's been used more times than you think. And right now, in January 2026, it's back in the headlines because of what's happening in Minneapolis. In the next 15 minutes, you're going to understand something that most Americans, including most politicians, don't fully grasp. And by the end, you might change your mind about whether this power should even exist. Let me start with the basics because the Insurrection Act sounds like something out of a dystopian movie, but it's very real, very legal, and very much part of American history. The Insurrection Act is a federal law that gives the President of the United States the authority to deploy active-duty military troops inside the country to suppress civil disorder, insurrection, or rebellion. Now, before you panic, understand this. It's not martial law. Martial law means the military takes over civilian government. The Insurrection Act is different. It's the president using the military to support civil authorities when things get so out of control that local police and even the National Guard can't handle it. The law itself dates back to 1807, signed by President Thomas Jefferson. Yes, that Thomas Jefferson. And why did he sign it? Because back then, the young United States was worried about internal uprisings, foreign invasions through domestic proxies, and the general chaos of being a brand new country trying to hold itself together. The original law was actually pretty limited. It let the president use the military to suppress insurrections and enforce federal law. But over the decades, it got expanded and modified, especially after the Civil War and during the Civil Rights Movement. Here's the thing most people don't realize. The Insurrection Act has been invoked dozens of times throughout American history. It's not some theoretical power that sits in a dusty law book. It's been used. And when you look at the history, it tells you a lot about when and why presidents think they need to bring in the military. Let's go through some of the most significant times it's been used, because context matters here. In 1957, President Dwight Eisenhower invoked the Insurrection Act to enforce school desegregation in Little Rock, Arkansas. You probably learned about the Little Rock Nine in history class. 9 black students tried to attend a previously all-white school, while an angry mob, and even the Arkansas National Guard tried to stop them. The governor of Arkansas, Orville Faubus, was actively resisting federal desegregation orders. So Eisenhower federalized the Arkansas National Guard and sent in the 101st Airborne Division, actual paratroopers, to escort those students to school. That was the Insurrection Act in action. The military wasn't there to take over the government. They were there to enforce federal law when state authorities wouldn't. Fast forward to 1992, and you get one of the most famous modern uses, the Los Angeles riots after the Rodney King verdict. If you're too young to remember, here's the short version. 4 LAPD officers were caught on video beating Rodney King, a black motorist, in 1991. When they were acquitted in April 1992, Los Angeles exploded. Riots, looting, buildings on fire, people being pulled from their cars and beaten. The LAPD couldn't contain it. The California National Guard was activated but still couldn't fully restore order. So President George H.W. Bush invoked the Insurrection Act and sent in active-duty military troops, Marines and Army soldiers, to help restore order. And it worked. Within a few days, the violence subsided. But here's the complicated part. Some people saw it as necessary to save lives and property. Others saw it as the government sending soldiers to occupy a community that was legitimately angry about police brutality. And that tension, that's what makes the Insurrection Act so controversial. It's a tool that can be used for good, like protecting civil rights, or it can be used in ways that feel oppressive, depending on your perspective and the circumstances. Now let's talk about the times it almost got used but didn't, because those are just as revealing. In 2020, during the protests and riots following George Floyd's murder, President Donald Trump publicly threatened to invoke the Insurrection Act. He said if governors didn't deploy enough National Guard troops to control the protests, he would send in the military himself. He literally said, "I will deploy the United States military and quickly solve the problem for them." That was a reference to the Insurrection Act, and it caused a massive uproar. Defense Secretary Mark Esper publicly opposed the idea. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Mark Milley later expressed regret for even appearing at a photo op that seemed to support military involvement. Ultimately, Trump didn't invoke it, but the fact that he threatened to show just how live this issue still is. Which brings us to right now, January 2026, Minneapolis. According to recent news reports, there are renewed discussions about the Insurrection Act in connection with civil unrest in Minneapolis. Some Republican senators have reportedly been discussing the possibility of President Trump invoking the Insurrection Act to address violence and disorder there. Now, I don't have all the details on what's currently happening on the ground. Situations like this develop quickly, but the fact that the Insurrection Act is being discussed again tells you this is a power that's never far from the surface when civil disorder breaks out. So let's get into the legal mechanics, because understanding how this actually works is crucial. The Insurrection Act isn't just one law. It's actually several sections of the U.S. Code, Title 10, Sections 251 through 255. Here's what each section basically says. Section 251 lets the president use the military when there's an insurrection against a state government, and that state requests federal help. So if a governor says, "We can't handle this, we need federal troops," the president can send them. Section 252 is about enforcing federal law. If someone is obstructing federal law or the execution of federal law, and it's impractical to enforce it through normal judicial proceedings, the president can use the military. Section 253 is the big one. It says the president can use the military whenever there's violence or conspiracy that makes it impracticable to enforce federal or state law through normal means, or when violence deprives people of their constitutional rights and state authorities can't or won't protect those rights. This is the section Eisenhower used in Little Rock. It's also the section Trump would have used if he'd invoked the act in 2020. Now here's what's really important. The president doesn't need Congress to approve it. The Insurrection Act gives the president unilateral authority. There's no vote. There's no waiting period beyond one procedural requirement. The president has to issue a proclamation ordering the insurgents to disperse. Basically a formal warning. But after that, if people don't disperse, the president can send in troops. And this is where it gets uncomfortable for a lot of people. We're talking about putting the president in charge of deploying the military inside the United States against American citizens without a check from Congress or the courts. That's an enormous amount of power. And throughout American history, we've generally been very nervous about that kind of power, which is why we have the Posse Comitatus Act. Let me explain Posse Comitatus, because you can't understand the Insurrection Act without understanding this. The Posse Comitatus Act, passed in 1878, says the military cannot be used for domestic law enforcement. It's a fundamental principle of American civil-military relations. The Army and Air Force, and by policy, the Navy and Marines, don't police American streets. That's what cops are for. The military fights wars overseas. That's the wall. But the Insurrection Act is the exception to Posse Comitatus. It's literally the legal doorway that lets the military through that wall. So when people freak out about the president using the military domestically, what they're really freaking out about is whether that exception is being used appropriately or whether it's being abused. And that brings up the big philosophical question: should this power exist at all? Let's steelman both sides. The argument for keeping the Insurrection Act goes like this. Sometimes civil disorder gets so bad that local and state authorities genuinely cannot handle it. Police departments can be overwhelmed. National Guard troops, who are part-time soldiers, might not have the training or numbers to restore order in a massive crisis. In those rare but critical moments, the federal government needs the ability to step in with the full force of the active duty military to save lives, protect property, and restore constitutional order. Without this power, you could have situations where American cities descend into prolonged anarchy. People die, rights are violated, and there's no recourse. The Insurrection Act is the emergency brake. The argument against it, or at least for severely restricting it, goes like this. Giving any president the unilateral power to deploy the military against American civilians is inherently dangerous. It's ripe for abuse. What one president calls an insurrection, another might call a protest. What one administration sees as restoring order, another might see as suppressing dissent. And once you normalize soldiers in the streets, once you break down that Posse Comitatus wall, you're on a slippery slope toward authoritarianism. History is full of examples, not in the U.S., but elsewhere, of leaders using the military to crush legitimate opposition under the guise of restoring order. Even if American presidents have mostly used it responsibly, the potential for abuse is terrifying. Both arguments have merit, and that's the tension. Nobody wants cities to burn, but nobody wants tanks rolling down Main Street either. There have been proposals to reform the Insurrection Act. Some members of Congress have introduced bills to require congressional approval before the president can invoke it, or to put a time limit on how long troops can be deployed, or to require more transparency and reporting. So far, none of those reforms have passed. The Insurrection Act remains essentially unchanged since the 1870s. Now, here's something interesting that doesn't get talked about enough: the role of military leaders in all this. When the president invokes the Insurrection Act, the military has to follow orders. That's how the chain of command works. But what happens when military leaders think invoking the act is a bad idea? We saw this tension in 2020. Senior military officials were clearly uncomfortable with the idea of deploying troops against protesters. Some spoke out, which is highly unusual. The military prides itself on being apolitical and subordinate to civilian control. But there's also a sense within the military that their role is to defend the Constitution, not just follow orders blindly. That's a delicate balance. And here's another wrinkle. What happens if a state refuses to cooperate? Under Section 253, the president doesn't need the governor's permission to send in troops. But imagine the optics and the practical difficulties if a governor is actively opposing federal deployment. You could have state police and National Guard troops who answer to the governor in a standoff with federal troops. That's a constitutional crisis waiting to happen. Let me give you a thought experiment. Imagine there's a major protest movement in a state, and the governor is sympathetic to the protesters. The president sees it as a violent insurrection and wants to invoke the Insurrection Act. The governor says no, there's no insurrection, just people exercising their First Amendment rights, and any violence is isolated and being handled. Who's right? Who decides? In our system, the president decides. And that's either a necessary feature or a terrifying bug, depending on your perspective. There's also the question of how the military itself would respond to being deployed domestically in ambiguous situations. Soldiers are trained to fight enemies. They're trained for war. Policing a riot or a protest is fundamentally different. The rules of engagement are different. The threat assessment is different. And soldiers are often younger, less experienced in de-escalation, and armed with weapons designed for combat, not crowd control. There's a real risk of things going very wrong very quickly. The Kent State shooting in 1970, where National Guard troops killed 4 student protesters, is a haunting reminder of what can happen when armed military personnel confront civilians. So where does this leave us in 2026? The Insurrection Act is back in news because of Minneapolis, and if history is any guide, it'll keep coming back every time there's major civil unrest. It's a law that reflects a fundamental tension in American democracy. How do you balance the need for order with the protection of liberty? How do you give the government enough power to handle genuine crises without giving it so much power that it becomes a threat to the very freedoms it's supposed to protect? There's no easy answer. But here's what I think everyone should understand. The Insurrection Act is not going away. It's been part of American law for over 2 centuries, and it's been used in moments both celebrated and condemned. It's a tool, and like any tool, it can be used well or poorly. The question isn't whether the tool should exist, though that's a legitimate debate. The question is who gets to decide when to use it, and what safeguards are in place to prevent abuse. If we're going to have this power in the hands of the president, then we as citizens need to be informed about it. We need to know when it's been used in the past, why it was used, and what the consequences were. We need to hold our elected officials accountable for how they talk about using it and whether they actually do. And we need to be willing to have uncomfortable conversations about the trade-offs between security and liberty, between order and freedom. Because here's the reality. The next time there's major civil disorder in the United States, and there will be a next time, the Insurrection Act will be on the table. And when that moment comes, your opinion will matter. Public pressure matters. Media scrutiny matters. Congressional oversight matters, even if Congress doesn't have to approve the deployment. All of those things create guardrails, even if they're not legal requirements. So let me leave you with this. Do you think the Insurrection Act should require congressional approval before the president can deploy troops domestically? Would that make it more democratic and less prone to abuse, or would it tie the president's hands in a genuine emergency when every hour counts? Drop your answer in the comments below, and let's have a real conversation about this, because this isn't hypothetical anymore. This is happening right now, and understanding it might be the most important civics lesson you get this year.